Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Make sure I have the right thing to share. A moment. Here we are. So because we completed the Rashis on Parshat Vayeshev, we're going back to Torah Temimah and back to Genesis and continuing there, and we're moving slowly along. So we're on verse 10, right? And we're talking about the third day, where God says, let the waters be gathered from under the heavens to one place, that the dry land should be seen, and so it was. Vayikra Elohim leyabasha eretz. God called the dry land eretz, land, earth. Velikmei hamayim kara yamim, and for the gathering of the waters he called yamim, seas. Vayar Elohim kitov, and God saw how good it was. So, and we know that good essentially means that it was a completed act. So we're on to this place, verse 10, mikveh hamayim, right? And to the gathering of the waters he called seas. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Rabbi Yossi says, Kol hayamim psulim v'zavim, so all the seas are unfit for one who has a seminal flow, ulemetzoraim, and for those who, it could be a woman who has blood that's issuing from her, and that this is defined in the book of Leviticus. It's for ongoing emission here. Ulemetzoraim means to lepers, ulekadesh bahem mechatat, and to sanctify with these waters the water. I think it's called the water of lustration. We're talking here about the ashes of the red heifer that were used to cleanse a person from tumat mate, from the impurity that one gets from being in contact with a corpse. My tama, and for what reason? Why would that be? Why would these waters be unfit for that kind of usage? The fish, in other words, you couldn't you couldn't use them to fill a mikveh or to make these special waters. What's the reason? The fisha kutuv kra'an mikveh, because Scripture calls them a gathering of waters. That means that they're all gathered into one place. And this is going to be clarified as to his reasoning in a little bit. Here he has the proof text, dichtiv, as it states, ulimikveh hamayim, and to the gathering of the waters, karayamim, he called the seas. And that's why the seas are no good for putting water into filling a mikveh, etc., with seawater or things like that. Can the sea itself be used as a mikveh? Well, possibly not for a zav or a metzora, and we'll see why. Because it turns out that when it comes to these kinds of levels of tumah, as opposed to the reason why a woman would go to the mikveh at the end of her regular menstrual period, the water for these kinds of purification, we'll see, is supposed to be flowing, living waters. So here we go. Ritzono lomar. So what's the point? What's the point he's making here? What he wants to say is shebetaharat kol ele, because when it comes to the purification of these particular categories of impurity, ketiv mayim chayim, Scripture talks about living waters. And what do we mean by living waters? Umayim chayim havu rak me mayanot, right? And with regards to living waters, they only refer to the water that comes from a well or a spring. Shehachayut shehachayut ba lahem mimakom acher, because their existence, right, their presence comes from a different place. Dahainu menikvei hakarka shebachtahtehem, meaning from the holes, the cracks in the earth that are underneath them. In other words, these particular collections that are in a mayan, in a spring, the water comes from elsewhere, whereas the water from the ocean is there permanently. Here we go. Aval me hayamim, but the water in the seas, ein mayanot shebetachtehen asuyin liyot novelahem. So with regards to the oceans, we know there are certainly places in the ocean where they do have places underneath, on the bottom of the ocean where water is coming from there, right? But the water that is on those springs that are underneath the ocean are not made to to well up for them. Um, um, uh, Mish, so, no, sorry, I think what he's saying is Novea lahem mishem mayim chayim. They're not considered to be that source, and they are not considered living waters. Ella adraba, but on the opposite, in fact, the opposite, derech sham mitzu motziin chiyutan kol hanarot shebaolam. But in fact, the reason why we have the oceans is because their existence, their life, quote, kayotan, comes from all the rivers that flow into the oceans, that's really the source of their existence or their continued existence. So chayot meaning, that the sense that they are living. They aren't just simply pools. And for that reason, Scripture calls them a gathering, because what they do is they are a gathering place for the rivers of the world. And so they're not considered living waters in the sense that a spring is considered living waters. Let's see if he has anything else to say there. No, that's the point being made. So let's make sure we've got the place. All right, next. Vayomer Elohim, and going on this third day, God said, Tadshe haaretz deshe, let the earth be covered with herbs, with grass, Esev Mazria Zera, plants or grass that is seed bearing, that causes seed to form. Eitz pri, fruit trees, Ose pri lemino, which makes fruit according to its species. Asher zar'obo, in which is its seat, al haaretz, over the earth, vayichen, and so it was. Let's take a look if we have. Here we are. Tadsher, right? So let it spring forth, etc. Tanya, again, we have this introduction. It's a technical term, meaning that the source is pre-Talmudic, meaning pre the year 200. It is contemporaneous with the Mishnah, that earlier source. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer says, by the way, of course, what you're noticing now is how consistently and constantly these rabbinic sources mention the names of the author of that particular source. And it's interesting as to why this is going on. There, of course, hundreds of names mentioned, some much more frequently than others. And I'm wondering to myself if this might have been a way of organizing and helping memorize, because originally this was oral law that we're talking about. And so originally it was not written down. It was only in the year 200 that Rabbi Judah the Prince decided that he was going to have to take the extraordinary step of putting this in writing. He was concerned that it would all be forgotten. At any rate, I wonder to myself if one of the reasons is to allow a person in their own minds to organize the particular position of these various rabbis and to help memorize it. So, min ayin shebi tishrei nivra ha'olam. So this is actually a well-known machloket, as you'll see, there is a dispute here between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua. And Rabbi Eliezer says, from where do we know that the world was created in the month of Tishrei, meaning in the fall, right? Shinemar, as it states, Tidshe haaretz deshe, as it says, let the earth sprout forth with grass, esav mazria, or herbs, grass that is forming seeds, eitz pri, and fruit trees. Ezehu chodesh sha'aretz mele'ah deshaim, what month is the land filled with grass, ve'ilan malei perot, and where the trees are filled with fruit? Heve Omer ze Tishrei. We'd have to say that this is Tishrei. For Afalpi, and despite the fact, dictive, as it says in verse 12, Eitz Oseh Pri, it says trees capable of producing fruit. Hahu Ledorot, that is just referring to future generations. In other words, when the trees, at least according to Rabbi Eliezer, when these trees were initially created, they were already bearing fruit. And that is a time of the fall when the fruit trees tend to start to ripen and mature. So as far as capable of making fruit, in other words, implying that the fruit would actually come later on, it's only that is for future generations. That is stated for subsequent generations. So this is his proof as to why the world was created in Tishrei, meaning in the fall. So now Rabbi Baruch Halevi Epstein mentions this major machloket, this major dispute or disagreement between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua. So he says, Rabbi Yehoshua Svirale, and Rabbi Yehoshua would argue and reason, B'Nisan Nivra Olam, that the world was actually created in Nisan, in other words, in the spring. V'daresh, and he interprets V'totzeh haaretz deshe esev v'etz oseh pri, and he understands this verse that says, let the earth spring forth with herbs and grass and trees capable of making fruit. Eze Chodesh, he interprets, what is the month Sha'aretz Motzi'ah Deshaim, when the earth springs forth with grass, Ve'ilan Motzei Peirot, and the trees start to produce fruit? Heve Omer Ze Nisan. We'd have to say this is Nisan. And he just makes a note here. I believe this is Kain Hu Girsat Habach. This is the version of the text of the Bach, a major commentary on the Gemara, on the Talmud, B'divrei Rabbi Eliezer v'Rabbi Yoshua, in the words of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua ben Nachon, and he's saying this is this version of the text is an accurate text, the way it's stated here. Vehine, and he says, but Afal pi dematzinu besugya yud bet aleph. Okay, and even though we find I believe in the version of the text, or at least the text on page 12a, and that would be referring back to this Rosh Hashanah, tractate Rosh Hashanah in the Bible, and there's page 11a. But if we look also on page 12a, the Chachmei Yisrael monim litkufat karabi Yoshua litkufot. So sorry. They count the Tukufot, that is the seasons of the year, like Rabbi Yehoshua. In other words, they start it in Nisan, right? We consider that the beginning of the counting of the astronomical cycles. B'chol zeh, nevertheless, kenir'eh, it appears, hevei sugya ta'ama karabi Eliezer, that nevertheless the actual practice, everyone's practice, follows Rabbi Eliezer. V'chein kavu b'tfilat Rosh Hashanah. And in fact, if you look at the prayer, the Amidah of Rosh Hashanah, you'll see it says, Zeh hayom tchilat ma'asecha. This is the beginning of your acts. This day is the beginning of your acts, implying the creation of the world. For Amru Rosh Hashanah, Kaf Zayin Aleph, and again in the tractate Rosh Hashanah on page 27a, the Nusach Zeh, that this particular formulation of the prayer, Atya Karabi Eliezer, it obviously is following Rabbi Eliezer, who says the world was created in Tishrei. V'chol hasugya sham shakil v'tare, and he says, and if you look at the Talmudic text there, it argues back and forth, le'ukme aliba de Rabbi Eliezer, to try and support Rabbi Eliezer's point of view against Rabbi Yoshua and show why he is correct. V'lachen kavanu drashto shel Rabbi Eliezer, and because of that factor in the Talmud text, the part that we quoted here in the Torah Temimah follows Rabbi Eliezer's point of view. V'yein od ma shekatuv bazeh lekaman, and this isn't the end of the subject. You should check more what's written regarding this matter later on in Pasuk Daled regarding verse 14, and we're talking about the footnote number 50. Okay. Going on, though, he has more to say about this. The Tosafot are also on the main page of the Talmud. If you look at a page of the Talmud, you'll see that in the center you have the Talmudic text itself, and then on the inside column you have Rashi's explanation, and on the outside of that text you'll see what are called Tosafot. And Rashi is there to explain the flow of the Gemara for the most part, and the Tosafot are the ones who get into details and basically very often will come up with what are called novellae, meaning new laws that are based on the old ones. So when you study Tosafot, they're very complex, very sophisticated, and they're not so much into explaining the Gemara as to developing the Gemara along new avenues. So, at any rate, right there on that page, Be'ota Sugya, referring to the same Sugya, in other words, the Talmud, the text of the Talmud is divided into Sugyot, which means a discussion concerning a specific aspect of halacha or a specific subject, and the discussions that took place regarding that. So in this particular discussion, this is where the Talmud is arguing back and forth regarding the position of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. Katvu, they wrote, that elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim, that in fact both positions are the words of the living God, meaning they're going to come up with an approach that can accept both positions. Yesh lomar, because you could say the b'tishrei Allah b'machshava, that in Tishrei the thought occurred, right? Lehibraot, to create the world. V'lo nivra ad Nisan, but the actual creation of the world didn't take place until Nisan. So that there were two stages here. In the first stage, God considered the issue of creating the world or the universe, period. And then later on in Nisan, the world was created, in fact. Uyan Shan, he says, look at that, check the Tosafot for yourself, see what they have to say. V'yesh liyashev al pi svartam, and so one can harmonize, right? One can because of their position, because of what they just said. Kushiyat Haran. The Ran is again a major commentator on the halachot of the Talmud. Very often he is found also in the back of the Talmud Bavli, and in the Vilna edition. He says that the difficulty or the question that the Ran raises, le Rabbi Yoshua, he poses a question on Rabbi Yoshua's position. Rabbi Yoshua is the fellow who says that the world was created in Nisan. My shayach minyan Rosh Hashanah. What place does the position of Rosh Hashanah mitishrei, right? In other words, or minayin, sorry, he's saying, Minai shayach minayin Rosh Hashanah mitishrei. Where does this question of Rosh Hashanah being in Tishrei even come up? Because as you know, Rosh Hashanah is the first of Tishrei. V'chein hanusach, and not only that, but the fact that betfilat Rosh Hashanah, that in the official prayers of Rosh Hashanah, the statutory prayers of Rosh Hashanah, it says, Zeh hayom tchilat ma'asecha. This was the day of the beginning of your actions. Acharei, since Rabbi Yoshua holds, the Svirale, the Nisan Nivra Olam, because he says that in Nisan the world was created. So how come Rosh Hashanah falls on the first of Tishrei if Rabbi Yoshua is correct? Ye'uyan Sham, and he says, check the Ran in this particular regard too. Aval divrei hatosafot. But if we take into account what we just read as the Tosafot, as their position, degam hu svirale de betishrei Allah, because Rabbi Yoshua could also accept the position that in fact in Tishrei, on the first of Tishrei, that was when God, it la b'machshava, it came into mind, lehibarot, for the world to be created. Necha, that's fine. He could have held, Rabbi Yoshua could have agreed. Yep, that was when God decided to create the world. V'lo kasha, and now there's no problem. Lama maninan mizman hamachshava, as to why we, in our prayers and elsewhere, it is considered the beginning of that, because that's when God first thought of it. V'lo mizman hamaseh, but not the time when the world, in fact, was created. In other words, clearly, you could have the world was considered, God considered creating the world on the first of Tishrei, but in fact created the world on the first of Nisan. Mi Nisan. Ya'an ki be'emet, because in a further consideration, right, that in truth, the machshava u'ma'aseh, that when it comes to consideration, the idea, u'ma'aseh, and the action, shayach rak bebasar v'adam, that only applies to mortals. In other words, separating the thought and creation is something that only really applies to mortals. Because when it comes to mortal human beings, as long as the action that's considered hasn't been accomplished before, in actual fact, it's always possible that his consideration, his thought, won't in fact be realized. It won't be actualized. But you can't hold that with regards to the Holy One, blessed be He. Because once God decided to create the world, He wasn't going to change His mind. For imkain, and if this is the case, okay, then in that case you could say that's as if the world was actually created in Tishrei, Vedok, and he's saying QED. So it occurred to me when I was reading this that, of course, we do have a great example of where God changes his mind. And we can find other examples. The great example that I can think of is in the book of Jonah, where God, in fact, does change his mind, right? And we also, of course, have the section with Abraham arguing with God not to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, but because of what was actually going on there, and the fact that there weren't two righteous men in each city, God decided to go ahead with his initial plan. But when it came to the city of Nineveh, then God did change his mind. So I think that what we could say is that this is an exception that proves the rule, and that is the power of tshuva. And I think there's some other thoughts that go along. That, we get into certain habits, and they may be very bad and self-destructive or destructive habits. And it is so difficult to really, really do tshuva. And really doing tshuva, I think one of the things that the rabbis say is that, if you're always, of course, in a position where you could go back on your tshuva, but if you encounter exactly the same situation that led you into problems to begin with, and you don't repeat the bad action, then you've done tshuva. And I think precisely because real tshuva is such a difficult thing to accomplish that for that reason, it even has the power for God to reconsider what he's doing. So that's the thought I have. I'm going to stop the screen sharing and we'll go ahead and stop the recording.